The blueprints arrived on a Wednesday, which was already the wrong kind of day. Garrett Voss had learned in the 4 years since he'd moved to Millhaven that Wednesdays carried a particular weight. Not bad exactly, just heavy. The kind of day where small things accumulated into something you couldn't name until you were lying in the dark at 10 o'clock wondering why your chest felt tight. He was under the hood of a Silverado belonging to a man named Ted, who hadn't paid his last invoice and probably wouldn't pay this one when he heard the courier knock on the open bay door. The knock was the tentative kind, the kind people gave when they weren't sure if a place was actually open or just looked like it might be. Garrett straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag that was past its useful life, and walked to the front. The courier was young, maybe 22, and looked mildly alarmed by the garage in the way that people sometimes looked alarmed by anything that smelled like oil and effort. He had a sealed envelope and a tablet for a signature, and the expression of someone executing a task they hadn't been given much context for. "Voss Auto?" the courier said. "That's the sign," Garrett said, nodding toward it. The envelope was thick, commercial stock, no return address, just a courier routing code. He signed, took it, and stood in the bay door, turning it over once before opening it. Inside were 12 pages of technical drawings, precision architectural blueprints for a mechanical clock movement, a grand complications piece, the kind that took master watchmakers years to complete. Each page was dense with dimensions and tolerances and material specifications, written in a hand he recognized the way you recognize the shape of your own name. He'd drawn these, every line. Not recently, 6 years ago, in a different life, at a drafting table in a building 30 stories, up in a city he no longer lived in. He'd drawn them over 9 months of work that had been the most technically demanding and personally consuming project of his engineering career, and he'd drawn them before everything fell apart. There was a note clipped to the top page. 3 sentences on plain cardstock. "We've recently acquired these from a closed estate sale. They were listed as miscellaneous archival documents. We'd like to discuss their provenance." The company name at the bottom was Aldrin Horologics. Garrett knew the name the way you know the name of something that changed the shape of your life. He stood in the bay door for a long moment. Outside, a truck passed on the county road. Somewhere down the block, someone's dog was doing its morning editorial on the state of things. He folded the note, put it back in the envelope, set the envelope on his tool bench, and went back to Ted's Silverado. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. His daughter Maya came home from school at 4, which was 4 minutes later than usual, and she appeared in the conjugal garage doorway still wearing her backpack, with one strap hanging off her shoulder and her cleats in her hand, because she'd come straight from practice without stopping to change. She was 12, lean and sharp-eyed, with her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking through something she hadn't decided to say yet. "There's a weird envelope on your bench," she said. "I know. Did you open it?" "I did." She set her cleats down with the automatic precision of a child who'd grown up navigating a garage floor and came further in, reading the room the way she always did before asking the direct question. "Is it something bad?" Garrett considered the question the way he considered most of her questions, not as something to redirect, but as something that deserved the honest version of an answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "It's something from before." She understood before. They had a shared vocabulary around it, built over 4 years of careful conversation and strategic silences. Before meant the years in Chicago. Before meant the job that consumed and then imploded. Before meant her mother too, though that was a different category of before, the one they handled more carefully. "Okay," Maya said, because she was 12 and she knew when to push and when not to. She grabbed an orange from the small refrigerator he kept in the corner and disappeared toward the house, calling back over her shoulder. "Mrs. Ferrante says you owe her a lasagna. She's been keeping count. Tell Mrs. Ferrante I haven't forgotten. She knows. She's just reminding you." He heard the screen door swing shut. He stood alone in the garage with the blueprints and the Silverado and the smell of metal and old oil that had long since stopped registering as a smell and had become simply the atmosphere of the only part of his life that still made uncomplicated sense. He pulled the blueprints out again and spread the first page on the clean section of his workbench. He'd been 29 when he designed the Meridian movement. That was what they called it internally. The Meridian, though it had never reached a public name, never reached anything close to public. It was a tourbillon skeleton movement with a perpetual calendar complication designed to run in a limited edition series of 20 watches for Aldrin Horologic's Centennial Collection. The project had been handed to him by a man named Harold Stokes, Aldrin's chief of engineering, who had found Garrett at a regional horological society lecture, where Garrett had been the youngest person in the room by approximately 15 years and had asked better questions than the presenters. Harold had said, "You understand how time works, not just mechanically. Come work for us." Garrett had gone. He'd spent 3 years inside Aldrin's engineering division, and the Meridian had been the project that crystallized everything he'd learned there. The precision, the patience, the specific obsession with accuracy that watchmaking demands. 9 months of his life in those drawings. Each tolerance calculated not to spec but past it, because Garrett believed that if you were going to build something that measured time, you built it to outlast your own lifetime by a significant margin. The project had been terminated 8 months before the centennial. He had been terminated 2 months before that. He pressed his thumb to the corner of the first blueprint, where he'd made a small notation in the margin. A calibration reminder to himself, written in a shorthand no one else would recognize. The notation was still there. They hadn't removed it. Either they hadn't noticed, or they hadn't known what it meant. He folded the blueprints. He put them back in the envelope. He went inside and made dinner. Maya did her homework at the kitchen table while he cooked, which was their standing arrangement. She was working through geometry proofs, with the focused irritation of someone who understood the logic but found the notation arbitrary, which was a position Garrett respected. "Dad!" "Were those blueprints from the clock job?" He turned from the stove. She was still looking at her homework, pencil moving, which meant she was asking the sideways version of the question she actually wanted to ask. "They were. From before you came here?" "Yes." She looked up then, and her expression was the one she used when she'd already thought through what she was about to say and decided it was worth saying. "You never actually told me what happened there. I've told you some of it. You've told me you left. That's not the same thing." He stood with the wooden spoon in his hand and looked at his daughter, who was 12 years old, and watching him with the patient certainty of someone who had decided this conversation was happening tonight. "There are parts of it I'm still figuring out how I want to explain," he said. She considered this the way she considered things she found unsatisfying but acceptable for the moment. "Okay," she said. "Then, were they something you made?" "Yes." "Then they're yours." She went back to her geometry. He went back to the stove, and the kitchen held the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other well enough that not everything needed to be spoken aloud. He called the number on the card at 7:15 the next morning, standing in the garage before he'd opened the bay doors. A woman answered on the second ring, professional, direct, with the particular cadence of someone who had learned to move fast through the preamble of conversations. "Aldrin Horologics, this is Vivian." "This is Garrett Voss. I received a package from your office yesterday." A brief pause. "Mr. Voss, thank you for calling. I'm Vivian Aldrin. I'm the CEO. I was hoping you'd reach out." He hadn't expected the CEO. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "You sent the blueprints yourself?" "I did. I apologize for the abruptness of the delivery. I didn't have a better way to make contact, and I wanted you to see them before we spoke." Another brief pause, and when she continued, her voice had lost some of the professional speed. "I found them 3 months ago, in my father's private archive." Garrett stood very still. Thomas Aldrin had died 14 months ago. He'd read about it in a trade publication he still received out of habit, even after leaving the industry. The man who'd built Aldrin Horologics from a failing Swiss parts supplier into one of the most respected independent watchmakers in North America. Garrett had met him twice. He'd been the kind of man who made you feel briefly that you'd said something worth hearing. "I'd like to come and see you," Vivian said. "If you're willing." "Why?" "Because those blueprints were in my father's files marked protected, not archived, not closed, protected." A pause. "And because I've spent 3 months trying to understand why the Meridian project was terminated, and the more I look, the more questions I have." Garrett looked at the envelope on his bench, at the blueprints inside it that had crossed 6 years of distance and arrived at his bay door on a Wednesday, like something that had been waiting for him to be ready. "When were you thinking?" he said. Saturday, if that works. I'll be here. She came alone, which he hadn't expected. A dark sedan, practical but expensive, pulling into his gravel lot at 10 minutes past the time she'd said, which suggested either traffic or the kind of person who builds buffer time and occasionally miscalculates it. She was younger than he'd anticipated, maybe 32. Dark hair pulled back, a coat that was well made without being conspicuous, and the kind of posture that came from someone who had spent years in rooms where posture mattered and had long since stopped thinking about it. She stepped out of the car and looked at the garage, the weathered sign, the 2 bay doors, the gravel lot, the modest building, with the brief stillness of someone adjusting an expectation. Then she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Miss Aldrin," he said. He stepped back and let her into the garage. She stopped just inside the entrance, taking in the space with the attentiveness of someone who was reading a room rather than just looking at it. The tools on the wall precisely hung. The workbenches clear except where he was actively working. The Silverado still waiting for Ted, who still hadn't paid. "You service vehicles," she said. "It pays the bills. You were Aldrin's lead precision engineer for 3 years. I was." He looked at her steadily. "Would you like to see the blueprints, or would you like to discuss what you already know?" Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, closer to recognition. "Both," she said, in that order. He showed her the blueprints. He walked her through the meridian movement with the same precision and economy of language he'd used when explaining it to Harold Stokes 6 years ago. The tourbillon cage design, the perpetual calendar mechanism, the specific alloy choices for the escapement wheel that he'd argued for against the procurement team's preference for cheaper alternatives, and eventually won. He spoke quickly, without performance, in the vocabulary of someone who had lived with these details long enough that they'd become instinct rather than knowledge. Vivienne said very little through most of this. She held the blueprints carefully, turned each page with the respect of someone who understood what they were holding, and asked 2 questions, both precise, both demonstrating that she'd done real preparation before arriving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn this?" she said. "Mechanical engineering degree, a machine shop apprenticeship, 3 years inside your company, and about 10,000 hours of thinking about how precision systems fail." He paused. "Where did you learn to ask the right questions about it?" "My father taught me to read technical drawings before he taught me to read a balance sheet," she said. It came out without the professional coding her other words carried. Just a fact, and briefly, something underneath it. "He was a good teacher," Garrett said. "He was." A pause. "He was better at some things than others." He looked at her for a moment. "Why is the meridian movement in your father's protected archive?" She set the blueprints down on the workbench and turned to face him directly. "That's what I need you to help me understand." The coffee shop on Millhaven's Main Street was called The Crossing, which had been its name since it was built next to the old rail depot in 1962, and which had outlasted the depot by 40 years without any apparent crisis of identity. It had 4 booths, a counter with 8 stools, and coffee served in mugs that were heavy enough to use as ballast. Garrett ate breakfast there on Tuesdays. The owner, a woman named June, who had been running the place since her mother retired, knew his order without asking. He arrived at 8 on a Monday morning. Vivienne was already there, in the booth near the back window, with a coffee and a folder, and the particular focused stillness of someone who had done preparation and was now in execution. She'd driven down from Chicago the night before. He hadn't asked her to do that. She'd simply said she'd be there at 8, and she was. "You found something," he said, sliding into the booth. "I found several things," she said, "and I want to ask you what you know before I tell you what I found." June appeared and filled his coffee without being asked. He nodded at her. "Ask," he said. "Your name is not on the Meridian Project documentation." Vivienne said it directly without preamble. "Not in the engineering records, not in the patent applications, not in the project reports. Every reference to the lead engineer has been replaced with a notation. Principal designer, position restructured, files restricted." Garrett wrapped both hands around his mug. The ceramic was solid and warm. "I know," he said. "You know. I suspected it during the last 3 months I was still there. I confirmed it about a year after I left, when I was trying to understand what I had legal standing to pursue." He stopped. I ran out of legal standing before I ran out of questions. Vivienne's eyes were steady on him. Who authorized the removal? In the documents you have access to? She opened the folder and turned it toward him. A name was highlighted in a chain of authorization records. Conrad Bale. Aldrin's head of strategic development for 11 years. Garrett's jaw was very still for a moment. Where did you find this? Procurement records, cross-referenced with HR administrative actions. She paused. Conrad was responsible for vendor relationships, including a partnership with a Swiss component supplier called Martel Precision. He had a consulting agreement with Martel that wasn't disclosed internally. He looked at her. She looked back. The Meridian project used a competing domestic supplier, he said. One I'd argued for. The components were better, more expensive, but the tolerances were tighter and the reliability projections were significantly stronger. If the Meridian had gone to production, Vivienne said quietly, Martel would have lost the contract. Conrad had a financial interest in Martel losing as little as possible. Yes. She closed the folder. It's a theory, but the documentation is interesting. He thought about Conrad Bale, 11 years at Aldrin, silver-haired, smooth in the way of someone who had learned exactly which rooms to be warm in and which rooms to be cold in. He'd called Garrett's son in meetings, in the tone that sounded like familiarity and operated like condescension. He'd praised the Meridian project in presentations, and then, Garrett had later understood, worked methodically to ensure that when the project ended, it ended in a way that left no particular individual accountable for its promise and no particular individual positioned to object to its cancellation. He'd also been the one who had denied Garrett's request for a medical hardship accommodation. Angie had been in her second round of treatment. The accommodation was written into his employment contract, a provision for family medical circumstances that was supposed to be straightforward. Conrad had found 3 procedural objections over 4 months, each one requiring a response that took 3 weeks to process, and by the time the last one was resolved, Angie was in her 3rd round, and Garrett had borrowed from everyone who would lend and was carrying the specific exhaustion of a person who is managing a medical crisis and a professional crisis simultaneously while trying to make sure that a 12-year-old, she'd been 8 then, went to school with lunch packed and homework done and some reasonable approximation of a stable father. He'd been called in for a restructuring meeting 10 days after the final accommodation denial was processed. He'd signed the separation agreement in a hospital waiting room while Angie was in surgery. His lawyer had told him the NDA clause was aggressive but enforceable, that fighting it would take 2 years, and that his position had been structured in a way that would make wrongful termination difficult to argue without significant documentation he didn't currently have access to. He'd signed it. He'd driven home. He'd sat in the parking garage of their apartment building for 20 minutes, looking at the steering wheel. Then he'd gone upstairs because Maya needed dinner, and the world continued to require things of him regardless of what it was also taking away. My wife was sick, he said. It came out the way it always came out when he said it, plainly, without inflection, because inflection made it harder to get through. She died 14 months after I left. During the period when I was trying to pursue any kind of legal avenue, she was in treatment and then she wasn't, and then she was gone and I had a 9-year-old and no money and a non-disclosure agreement. The coffee shop moved around them. June was behind the counter. Someone at the other end was reading a newspaper. An ordinary Monday morning in a small town, sitting alongside the weight of what they were saying. Vivienne was quiet. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone managing their own reaction. Conrad Bale used the timing, she said. Yes, he knew you couldn't fight. I think he counted on it. She looked at her coffee for a moment, then at him. I'm sorry, she said. No professional cushioning, just human. Thank you, he said. She reached into the folder and pulled out a single page. She set it on the table between them without announcement, the way you set something down when you want it to speak for itself. It was a photocopy of a handwritten letter. Thomas Aldrin's handwriting. She confirmed it before he could ask, with a brief nod. Dated 8 months before his death. I have been reviewing the Meridian project files with increasing concern, the letter began. What I have found regarding the termination of the project and the administrative actions taken against the project's principal designer represents a serious failure of this company's stated values. and my personal standards of conduct. I should have looked more closely when it happened. I did not. That failure belongs to me. Garrett read the rest of it slowly. He read it like a person who has trained himself to process things at a measured pace, so that his face doesn't do something he hasn't decided to do. Thomas Aldrin had found the documentation trail 3 years after Garrett's departure. He'd spent 6 months building a private case. He'd identified the Martel consulting arrangement, the deliberate accommodation delays, the systematic removal of Garrett's name from his own work. He'd written a letter to his board of directors laying out everything he'd found, and at the bottom, in smaller handwriting than the rest, as though it had been added last. Garrett Voss built something that this company will not see again for a generation. What was done to him was done in the shadow of my inattention, and it will not stand. When I correct this, and I will correct this, I want his name on everything he built. He deserved better than what we gave him. Garrett read that paragraph twice. Then he put the letter down carefully and looked at the table for a moment. He didn't finish it, Vivian said. He died before he presented it to the board. The letter was in his personal files. It took me 3 months of going through his estate to find it. He knew. Garrett said it quietly, not as an accusation, just as a fact that had arrived late. He found out. A pause. There's a difference, I think. He didn't know when it happened. He found out later, and he was trying to fix it. Garrett thought about that. He thought about the version of himself that had spent the first 2 years after Millhaven in a state of controlled grief. For Angie, for the work, for the specific quiet rage of having made something real and watching it get buried. And about the slow, deliberate process of building a life in this small town that didn't require him to think about Chicago very often. What do you want to do with what you've found? He said. She looked at him directly. That depends on what you want. He waited. I have the letter. I have the financial records. I have the authorization chain showing Conrad's removal of your name from the project documentation. She paused. I also have the original Meridian blueprints, which my father kept in his protected archive for reasons that are now clear to me. A pause. I'm the CEO of this company. What I do with this information is within my authority. But you have more stake in it than I do, and I'm not going to move without knowing where you stand. Outside the window, Millhaven was doing its Tuesday morning on a Monday things. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Somewhere down the block, the hardware store was putting out a sidewalk display of snow shovels that was approximately 4 weeks ahead of the actual weather. Garrett thought about Conrad Bale. He thought about the specific calculation involved in what had been done. Not the impulsive cruelty of someone who acts without thinking, but the patient, deliberate cruelty of someone who identifies the moment a person can least afford to resist and moves then. That required a kind of attention, a kind of sustained, focused intention aimed in the wrong direction. He thought about what it would mean to take that apart. The company employs a lot of people, he said. The watch division, the engineering team. People who had nothing to do with what Conrad did. If this comes out in a way that damages Aldrin's reputation in the market, those people pay for something that isn't their fault. Vivienne was watching him carefully. Yes, she said, that's a real consideration. So whatever you bring to your board needs to be targeted. Conrad specifically. The company's stability has to be protected in the process. He paused. And I want the record corrected. My name on the Meridian documentation. The patent record, if there is one, corrected to reflect who actually designed it. Not because I need the recognition. I know what I built. But because the record should be accurate. And because my daughter is 12 years old and should know what her father's work actually was. Something moved through Vivienne's expression. She didn't look away from it. That's completely reasonable, she said. All of it. He nodded. He looked at the letter on the table. The Meridian, he said. The blueprints are still viable. She looked at him carefully. The movement I designed 6 years ago was built for a production run of 20 pieces. The tolerances are tighter than what's standard in the industry now. And the industry has moved significantly in 6 years. With the modifications I've been mentally drafting since the project ended, modifications I never had the chance to implement. He stopped. I'm telling you the blueprints are worth more than an archival document. Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. My father's centennial collection never happened, she said. The company's 100th anniversary passed without it because the Meridian was the centerpiece and the meridian died. A pause, barely perceptible. The 107th anniversary is in 14 months. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to answer that now, she said. I'm asking you to consider it. Maya was in the garage when he got back, which wasn't unusual. She came in after school sometimes, just to sit on the stool at the corner workbench. Her stool, claimed through 4 years of consistent occupation, and do homework or read or ask questions about whatever he was working on. She found the garage useful in the way some people find libraries useful. Something about the particular combination of noise and purpose that made it easier to think. She looked up when he came in and read his face with the speed of long practice. How was the meeting useful? Was she okay? The Aldrin woman? He considered this. She's working on something difficult. She's taking it seriously. Maya nodded, in the way that meant she was filing that for later processing. She went back to her book. He went to the workbench where the blueprints were still spread, and he stood over them for a while, tracing lines he'd made with his own hand 6 years ago. Dad, if you made those, and someone took them and said they weren't yours, that's stealing, right? Like actually stealing. He looked at her. She was watching him over the top of her book with the direct, uncomplicated moral clarity that 12-year-olds have before the world teaches them to qualify it. Yes, he said, that's what it is. She went back to her book. He went back to the blueprints, and the garage was quiet in the way the garage got quiet in the late afternoon, the particular stillness of a space that had seen a lot of work and was patient about seeing more. The board meeting was on a Thursday at Aldrin's headquarters in Chicago, on a floor that smelled like precision and money and the particular anxiety of a company that was about to hear something it hadn't known about itself. Garrett sat along the wall, not at the table. He wasn't a board member, and the distance was also a kind of statement. He was there as a witness and, if needed, as a technical resource. Vivienne had been specific about that. He was there because the truth of what he'd built needed to be in the room with the people who were going to decide what to do about it. She presented without theater. The financial records first, the Martel arrangement, the undisclosed consulting fees, the dollar amounts accruing to Conrad Bale over 8 years of a relationship he'd never disclosed. Then the authorization chain showing the removal of Garrett's name from the Meridian documentation. Then the accommodation denial timeline, cross-referenced against Conrad's administrative calendar, showing that each delay had been actively managed rather than bureaucratically accidental. Then Thomas Aldrin's letter. She set copies in front of each board member without announcement and said, "Please read from the section I've marked on page 2. The room read. Conrad Bale read. Garrett watched Conrad's face from his chair along the wall and saw the moment the man understood what he was looking at. The composure didn't break. It held with more visible effort than before. But it held because men who build things like Conrad had learned early to manage their faces in rooms like this one. What couldn't be managed was the letter, a dead man's handwriting. A private document from a private archive, written by the founder of the company Conrad had spent 11 years operating inside. You couldn't reframe it. You couldn't file an objection to it. Conrad said the Meridian project had been terminated for legitimate technical reasons, that the documentation decisions had been made on legal counsel's advice, that Thomas Aldrin's letter reflected incomplete information gathered at a time of declining health. Vivienne let him finish. Then she said, "The board will vote on the motion to suspend your executive authority pending formal investigation." 7-2. Conrad stood with the dignity of someone who had practiced standing with dignity under adverse circumstances. He said he looked forward to being vindicated by a properly conducted review. He left. The room held the specific quiet of a significant action having been completed. A board member named Augustin Reyes, who Vivienne had described in her briefing to Garrett as someone with no particular allegiance to Conrad and 30 years of watching companies do things they later regretted, looked down the table at Garrett along the wall. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I think the board would benefit from hearing from you directly." Garrett stood. He moved to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down, and 10 people looked at him across polished wood. He was 38 years old, in clothes that were his best without being remarkable, with hands that were clean, but showed the history of the work they'd done. He had nothing to perform. "The Meridian movement works," he said. "It always worked. The blueprints in your archive are the complete design specifications for a tourbillon complication that I designed over 9 months, and that was technically ready for production when the project was terminated. He paused. I've identified modifications that would significantly improve the original design. Improvements I've had 6 years to calculate and no opportunity to implement. With those modifications, the movement would be competitive at the highest level of the independent watchmaking market. He looked around the table. My name was removed from that work by someone who benefited from the project's failure. I want it restored, not because I need anyone to tell me what I built, but because my daughter is 12 years old and the record should be accurate. The votes on the record correction and compensation restoration were unanimous. The vote on reviving the Centennial Collection, now the Sesquicentennial Project, Vivienne's reframing, which Garrett thought was better, was 7-2, with the 2 dissenting votes asking for more time to review production costs, not opposing the principle. Afterward, in the hallway outside the boardroom, Vivienne came to stand beside him at the window that looked out over the city. "How are you?" she said. "Honest answer?" "Always. I'm not sure yet." He looked at the city. Somewhere out there, the highway south would take him back to Millhaven, to the garage and Maya and the Tuesday morning regulars who brought him things that were broken. There's something strange about having a thing be over that you've been bracing against for 6 years. The bracing becomes a habit. What does it feel like when the bracing stops? He thought about it. Like the ground might be solid after all. You're not sure yet. You have to test it. She looked at him sideways. That's an engineer's way of describing relief. I'm an engineer. I know, she said. And something in her expression was briefly, completely unguarded. For what it's worth, I knew from the moment I opened those blueprints that my father had marked them protected for a reason. I just needed to find out what the reason was. He nodded. Below them, the city moved with its indifferent momentum. He drove home in the afternoon light, 5 hours of highway with the radio on low, and called Maya from a rest stop somewhere in the middle of Indiana. "How was it?" she said immediately. "It went the way it needed to. Did they say your name is real on the blueprints?" He paused. "Yeah," he said. "They said that. Good. With the completeness of someone for whom this is the only answer that matters. I made soup. It's probably fine. I only used 2 things I wasn't sure about. I'll be home around 9. I'll leave the light on." A pause, and then, in the tone she used when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided it was time, Mom would have thought this was a big deal. He stood at the rest stop. Cars passing on the interstate, the Indiana dusk going flat and gold over the rest of the lot. "Yeah," he said. She would have made you take a day off. Probably. I'm not going to make you take a day off. But I do think you should eat something before you drive." He almost laughed. "I'll get something." "Okay. And then Dad, I'm glad it happened." He leaned against the car. The evening was doing its thing. "Me too," he said. "The next months moved the way things move when they've been set in motion and are working correctly. Steadily, without requiring constant attention, each element leading to the next by the logic of well-made systems." Conrad Bale's formal investigation concluded in the winter. The consulting arrangement and its deliberate concealment fell into a category of conduct that Aldrin's governance code handled with specific and unambiguous language. His termination was quiet and swift, the way terminations are when the documentation leaves no room for extended argument. Garrett drove to Chicago once in November to review the initial production specifications for the Sesquicentennial movement with Aldrin's engineering team, 4 people, all younger than him, all technically rigorous in the way that good training produces. The lead engineer, a woman named Clara, had questions that were exactly the right questions. She argued with him about the escapement lever geometry with the precision of someone who'd done real preparation, and she was right about one detail, and he was right about the other 2, and they arrived at a solution that was better than either starting position. He drove home the same day and called Vivienne on the way to say the team was good. "I know," she said. "I hired Clara specifically because she doesn't defer. She doesn't good." A pause. "Are you going to be all right driving? You've been on the road for 6 hours. I'm fine. You sound tired." "I am tired." "That's different from not being fine." She was quiet for a moment. "Is there a difference?" "Usually," he said. "Ask me on a better day." She came to Millhaven in December. No stated professional reason, which was itself a kind of reason. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon with the specific unannounced quality of someone who had decided to stop building justifications and just arrive. He was in the garage when her car pulled in. He heard the tires on gravel and walked to the bay door, wiping his hands on a rag. She stepped out in jeans and a coat, no folder, no portfolio. She looked at the garage and then at him. "I was going to call," she said. "But you didn't." "No." A pause. "I was in the area." "You live in Chicago." "I was in the area of being somewhere that wasn't Chicago." She said it with the exact flatness of someone who has given up on the pretense but hasn't fully committed to the alternative yet. He stepped back and let her in. She stayed for dinner, which was Maya's doing. Maya had appeared in the garage doorway at 4:30, assessed the situation with the rapid competence she brought to all new social configurations, and said, "You should stay. Dad's making the pasta thing and it's actually good." Vivienne had looked at Maya for a moment, at the directness of the offer, the complete absence of performance in it, and said, "Okay." They ate at the kitchen table. Maya asked Vivienne 11 questions over the course of the meal, which was light work by Maya's standards. Vivienne answered each one without the deflecting courtesy that adults sometimes used with children who ask too many questions. When Maya asked what it was like to run a company, Vivienne said it was mostly about making decisions before you had all the information you wanted, and Maya said that sounded stressful, and Vivienne said yes, but less stressful than making decisions after the information was gone, which Maya found satisfying enough to move on to the next question. After dinner, Maya did homework at the table, and Garrett washed dishes and Vivienne dried them, which was something neither of them had suggested, and both of them had arrived at through the simple logic of two people standing in a kitchen at the end of a meal. "The sesquicentennial collection goes to production in March," Vivienne said, drying a bowl. "I know. Clara sent me the final spec confirmation. You should be there for the first production run." He looked at her sideways. "Clara has it. Clara is excellent. She's also been working from your blueprints and your specifications and your notations, and you should be there when the first movement comes off the bench." A pause. "So should Maya, if she wants to come." He handed her another bowl. She dried it. "She'd want to come," he said. "I thought so." A beat. "She's extraordinary, by the way. In case you needed someone else to confirm it. She gets it from her mother." Vivienne was quiet for a moment, then, "What was she like?" No one asked him that anymore. Not because the people around him didn't care, but because they'd learned to move around the subject the way you move around furniture you've stopped seeing. Automatically, without intention. "Stubborn," he said. "Funny when you didn't expect it." She was a physical therapist. She had this particular patience with people who were frustrated by their own bodies not working the way they wanted. She'd seen it enough that she never took it personally. She took it seriously instead. He stopped. She would have had a lot of opinions about all of this. Good opinions or difficult ones. "Both," he said. At the same time, that was her gift. Vivienne set the dried bowl on the shelf. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was about to say something she'd thought through, but wasn't sure how it was going to land. "My father was like that. Good and difficult at the same time. It took me a long time after he died to understand that I was grieving both the person he actually was and the conversation I'd never gotten to have with him about the ways he'd fallen short." She paused. "That's a specific kind of hard." "Yes," he said. "It is." The production run in March was a Friday. Garrett drove up the night before and stayed in a hotel 2 miles from the facility. Maya came with him, taking the day off school with the cheerful conviction of someone who'd decided the educational value of being present was sufficient justification. The facility was smaller than the old Chicago operation he'd worked in 6 years ago, cleaner, and arranged with the particular precision of a space designed by people who understood that watchmaking happened in the relationship between the worker and the bench as much as in the movement itself. Clara met them at the door with the focused energy of someone in the final stretch of something that had consumed her attention for months. She showed Maya the assembly station with the patience of someone who understood that a 12-year-old asking genuinely technical questions was a different category of visitor from one performing interest. Vivienne was already there, standing near the main bench. The first movement came together at 2 in the afternoon. The watchmaker, an older man named Ben, who had been with Aldrin for 26 years. and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had long since stopped trying to prove anything, set the final component and looked up at Clara and nodded once. Clara looked at Garrett. He walked to the bench. He crouched slightly, brought his eyes level with the movement, and looked at it. The tourbillon cage turning. The calendar mechanism in its correct relation to the mainspring barrel. The escapement engaging and releasing with the specific sound. Not quite a tick. More precise than a tick. A sound that meant the physics were working, that the theory had become a physical fact operating in real time. His notation was on the casebook, his calibration shorthand transferred from the original blueprints. The design he'd made with his own mind and his own hands, marked with his own initials on the documentation that now correctly attributed it. He stood. Maya was beside him. She'd materialized there silently, the way she did when she'd decided something deserved her full attention. "Is it what you thought it would be?" she said quietly. He looked at the movement turning. "Better," he said. She nodded, satisfied. She slipped her hand into his briefly, the way she hadn't since she was maybe 8 or 9, and then let go and stepped back, and he understood the gesture for what it was. An acknowledgement. Not of the movement, or the board meeting, or the blueprints, or the 6 years. Of him. Just him, standing here, having made it to the other side of something. He looked at the movement a moment longer. Then he turned, and Vivian was there, a few feet away, watching him with the expression she used when she wasn't trying to manage what her face was doing. "Your father kept them marked protected for 3 years," he said. "He was building the case. He just didn't finish in time." "No," she said. "He didn't. But he started it. And you finished it." She held his gaze. "We finished it." The movement ran. The calendar counted forward. Ben made a note in the production log with the date and the movement number, and the name of the designer, which was now, officially, correctly, permanently, the right name. Outside, the March afternoon was doing the thing it does in that part of the country. Cold and clear, winter not quite surrendered, but losing ground. Garrett Voss, in a small room in a building in Chicago, watched a clock he'd designed run for the first time, and the thing that had been sitting in his chest for 6 years. The bracing, the held breath, the quiet stubbornness of a man who had kept the faith with something no one else could see, set itself down. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way ground settles when something beneath it has finally stopped shifting. The clock kept time. It had always known how to do that. It had just been waiting for the room.